There are cases where the ending feels like it was written long before it happened, where if you line up everything that occurred in sequence, the warning signs are so visible and so consistent that the horror of the outcome becomes almost impossible to separate from the horror of how thoroughly it was allowed to build. This is one of those cases. A man with a rank and a uniform quietly planned something so deliberate that it is hard to believe it unfolded the way it did, inside an institution that was supposed to have rules about exactly this kind of thing. The woman at the center of it was 27 years old. Her name was Melissa Marie Hackert Harrington, and the people closest to her called her Bunny. The early 1990s were a particular kind of time for the United States military. The Cold War had just ended, and there was a sense of transition running through every branch of service. Personnel were being shuffled, careers were being evaluated, and the culture inside military institutions was still adjusting to a world that was slowly starting to ask harder questions about how servicemen and servicewomen were being treated within the ranks. Andrew Chabrol was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, stationed in Virginia. He had worked his way through the ranks and held a position that came with responsibility, structure, and the expectation of professional conduct. He was married. He had a life that, from the outside, looked like the respectable life of a career military officer. He had the kind of reputation that comes from putting on a uniform every day and showing up on time and doing what was asked of him. Melissa Marie Hackert Harrington, known to nearly everyone around her as Bunny, was also in the Navy, serving in an enlistee capacity. She was a young woman in her 20s with a warmth about her that people around her noticed right away. She was married as well, and by all accounts, she was someone who took her work seriously and carried herself with a quiet confidence that made her well liked by the people she served alongside. She was not looking for trouble, she was not looking for drama, she was just doing her job, trying to build a career in a demanding environment and getting on with her life. These two people crossed paths because of their shared assignment, and for a long time, that was all it was. A shared assignment, a shared workplace. Two people who happened to serve under the same umbrella of command and occasionally occupied the same professional spaces. But somewhere along the way, Andrew Chabrol decided that was not enough. What started as Chabrol noticing Harrington eventually turned into something much more persistent and much more uncomfortable. He began asking her out, approaching her in the way that a man who believes his attention is a gift approaches someone who has not asked for it. She told him no. She was married. He was married. They were colleagues. None of that seemed to register with him the way it should have, because he asked again, and when she said no again, he asked again after that. Over time, the rejections piled up, and still he kept coming. She was not sending mixed signals. She was not being vague or ambiguous. She was telling him clearly and consistently that she was not interested, and he was choosing not to accept it. There is something important in that distinction, the difference between a person who is unsure and a person who simply refuses to hear what they are being told. Chabrol was not unsure. He was refusing to hear her. For Melissa Harrington, going to work began to carry a weight it should never have had to carry. The place where she was supposed to serve her country had become a place where she had to manage the unwanted attention of a superior officer on a near-constant basis. She tried handling it quietly, the way many women in institutional settings are expected to handle these things, hoping it would stop on its own, hoping he would find something else to focus on, hoping that one more firm refusal would be enough to end it. It was not. At some point, Harrington had endured enough. She filed a formal sexual harassment complaint against Chabrol with his superiors, which was not a small thing to do inside a military structure in the early 1990s. Filing that kind of complaint required a person to put their name to a serious accusation, to sit down in front of authority figures and say plainly that someone with more rank than them had been behaving in a way that was unacceptable. It took courage. It took the decision that protecting herself mattered more than making things comfortable for the man who had been making her uncomfortable for so long. His superiors investigated. They looked at what had happened, reviewed the situation, and concluded that the complaint had merit. The way the Navy handled it was not to immediately discharge Chabrol or to bring him before any formal criminal proceeding. What they decided instead was that he would be allowed to complete his current term of service, and then he would not be retained. He would finish out his time, and then his career in the Navy would be over. He would be eased out rather than thrown out, which was a distinction that mattered a great deal to him, even as it probably felt inadequate to Harrington. For Chabrol, the result of that investigation was catastrophic in a way that only someone who had already built a distorted picture of the situation could understand. He did not look at what happened and think, "I behaved badly, I was held accountable, and now I am facing the consequences. He looked at what happened and decided that Melissa Harrington had destroyed his career. He decided that she was the villain of the story, that she had taken something from him, and that she was responsible for everything that was falling apart in his life, including his marriage, which was also struggling by this point. That reframing, the transformation of himself into the victim and her into the enemy, is something that matters deeply to understanding everything that came after it. People who knew Chabrol during this period would later describe him as increasingly withdrawn and angry. He was not the kind of person who wore his feelings openly, but something had shifted in him, and those close to him could sense it even if they could not name it precisely. What they did not know was what he was doing in private. Chabrol kept a journal on his computer, and in that journal he wrote about Melissa Harrington. He did not use her name in the entries, not usually. He referred to her instead as his nemesis, a word that carries a very specific weight, because a nemesis is not just someone you dislike. A nemesis is someone you believe has wronged you in a fundamental way, someone against whom you have justified grievance, someone whose punishment you consider deserved. In calling her that, he had constructed an entire internal logic for what he was planning, a logic in which what he intended to do to her was not evil, but righteous. The entries in that journal were not vague or ambiguous. They described in specific terms what he intended to do to her. He wrote about wanting to rape her. He wrote about wanting to kill her. He wrote these things down, saved them, and continued his life on the surface, as a man finishing out his military service and living in Virginia, while underneath that surface something was growing that the people around him had no way of seeing. He did not act right away. He waited. And while he waited, he planned. And as he planned, he found an accomplice. Stanley Berkeley was connected to Chabrol, and what drew them together in the context of this particular crime was a shared willingness to participate in something monstrous. Chabrol shared his intentions with Berkeley, and Berkeley agreed to help him carry them out. The two of them began working through the logistics of what they planned to do to Melissa Harrington. There is something that makes cases like this particularly chilling, and it is not the violence itself, but the preparation. The fact that two people sat together at some point and had a conversation about a real woman's life and decided together how they were going to take it from her. That conversation happened. That planning happened. And through all of it, Harrington was going about her daily life, completely unaware that the man she had reported for harassment had spent months turning her into a target. In 1991, Andrew Chabrol and Stanley Berkeley carried out the plan that Chabrol had been building toward since the investigation ended his career. Chabrol put on a disguise so that Harrington would not recognize him immediately. He and Berkeley located her and took her by force, binding her arms and legs and covering her mouth and eyes with duct tape so that she could not call out or see where she was being taken. Then they moved her to Chabrol's house. What Harrington experienced during those hours is something that belongs only to her. A woman who was bound and blindfolded and transported to the home of the man who had been obsessing over her, who had planned this, and had written about it in his private journal, as though it were something he was owed. When she arrived at his house, he tied her to his bed, and then, in what appears to have been a deliberate act of cruelty that had nothing accidental about it, he removed her blindfold and let her see who had taken her. He told her who he was, and he told her what he was going to do. What followed was sustained and calculated. Chabrol sexually assaulted her. Berkeley then assaulted her multiple times. Chabrol used a taser on her, applying it to her body in a way that served no purpose except to cause her pain. And then, when he had carried out what his journal entries had described months earlier, Andrew Chabrol strangled Melissa Harrington to death. After she died, Berkeley continued to violate her body. None of what happened in that house during those hours was a crime of passion or a moment of lost control. It was the execution of a plan that had been in development for the better part of a year, designed and carried out by two men who felt no restraint about any of it. Later that same day, while Chabrol and Berkeley were still inside the house and in the process of trying to dispose of her body, police arrived at the residence. The exact circumstances that led law enforcement to Chabrol's door at that particular moment are unknown, but what matters is what they found when they got there. Officers walked into Chabrol's bedroom and found Melissa Harrington dead. Both men were arrested at the scene, and the chain of events that followed moved with a clarity that capital cases rarely have, because the evidence, including the journal entries in which Chabrol had documented his intentions in writing, left very little room for ambiguity. For Harrington's husband and for the people who had loved her, The news carried all the weight that such news always carries, but woven into the grief was something additional and particularly hard to sit with. She had tried to protect herself. She had used the formal reporting system. She had trusted that the institution would intervene, and the institution had let the man she was afraid of walk out on his own terms, with enough time and freedom to plan what he then carried out. Andrew Chabrol pleaded guilty to the murder charge. He did not contest the facts. In 1992, a Virginia court sentenced him to death, and the journal he had kept on his computer became part of the official record that the court had before it when reaching that sentence. Stanley Berkeley received 3 consecutive life terms in prison, reflecting the crimes he had committed both alongside Chabrol and independently during those hours at the house. Chabrol made an unusual decision for someone on death row. He chose not to fight the execution. He did not pursue the lengthy appeals process that can extend a capital sentence by years or even decades. He accepted the sentence and indicated he would not challenge it through the legal avenues available to him. On June 17, 1993, Andrew Chabrol was executed by electric chair at Virginia's Greensville Correctional Center. Less than 2 years after Melissa Harrington had been killed inside his own bedroom, the New York Times ran a brief notice on June 19th confirming that a former Navy officer had been executed for murder. A few paragraphs. Then the news cycle moved on, the way it tends to. What came after the execution introduced a dimension to this story that would not be corrected for 30 years. Because Chabrol had been permitted to complete his term of service before being separated from the Navy, he had technically served under an honorable classification in the administrative sense. That status made him eligible for burial at Arlington National Cemetery, and after his execution, that is where he was buried. Arlington is one of the most symbolically significant places in the United States, a national burial ground for those who served the country, a place where military families go to grieve and to remember. Melissa Harrington was also buried at Arlington. The woman he had kidnapped, tortured, raped, and murdered rested in the same cemetery as the man who killed her. The death row chaplain who had been present in the period leading up to the execution later said that Chabrol had expressed what he described as a sick satisfaction about this fact, that he had found, even in death, a way to position himself alongside her in a place she deserved entirely and he deserved not at all. Whether anyone in an administrative role fully processed what they were authorizing before it happened is something worth sitting with. For Harrington's husband, this was a wound that did not heal. He had lost his wife to a man whose obsession with her had been documented before the crime occurred. He had watched that man be tried, sentenced, and executed. And then he had to live with the knowledge that Chabrol's name appeared in the same records as hers, in the same ground, in the same place he went to remember her. For 3 decades, that situation remained as it was. Then, in the early 2020s, a small group of veterans that included Harrington's husband began pushing seriously for legislative action. Their argument did not require any complicated legal philosophy. A man executed for raping and murdering a fellow servicewoman did not belong in a national cemetery that existed to honor service and sacrifice. The technical eligibility that had opened the door to his burial there was a procedural gap, not a statement of honor, and closing that gap was the right thing to do. In 2023, after advocacy efforts and the passage of legislation addressing this kind of situation, Andrew Chabrol's remains were removed from Arlington National Cemetery and reinterred at the burial ground associated with Fort Leavenworth, the federal military prison in Kansas, which maintains a cemetery for executed prisoners. His presence at Arlington, which had lasted 30 years, was ended. That it took 30 years is not a small thing to pass over quietly. Harrington's husband spent 3 decades knowing that the man who murdered his wife shared a cemetery with her before enough momentum gathered to change it. The correction was right and long overdue, and the length of time it required says something real about what happens when the people most affected by institutional decisions do not have institutional power pushing in the same direction they are. What stays with you about this case is not the mystery of what happened, because unlike so many crimes that go unresolved, this one was thoroughly documented from the journal entries to the guilty plea to the execution. What stays with you is the window. The months between the investigation and the crime during which Chabrol's intentions existed in writing on a computer, during which he was carrying out his regular life on the surface while planning something specific and documented underneath it. The system that was supposed to protect Melissa Harrington had her harasser's behavior on record and responded by giving him an orderly exit. She was 27 years old. She had a husband. She had a nickname that came from people who loved her. She had done exactly what you are supposed to do when someone in your workplace will not leave you alone, and none of it saved her. The veterans who stood beside her husband and pushed until Chabrol was removed from Arlington gave her something back that should never have been taken in the first place, a space that was entirely hers. A cemetery that no longer held the name of the man who killed her alongside hers. Bunny Harrington deserved better than what she got from the institution she served. She deserved better than what happened to her in 1991, and she deserved better than what happened quietly in a cemetery in Virginia for 30 years after that. What she got instead, eventually, was a group of people who refused to stop pushing until something changed. That matters. Even when it takes 30 years, it matters. If this story made you think, or if you have thoughts on cases where institutions fail the people they are supposed to protect, or on how accountability works and sometimes does not, inside systems built on rank and authority, leave your thoughts in the comments below. It is the kind of conversation worth having. If you are new here and this is the kind of storytelling you want more of, subscribing takes about 2 seconds and it genuinely helps this channel keep going. And if this one was worth your time, a like goes a long way too. There are more stories like this one coming, and I will see you in the next one.